Welcome everybody to today's Ona Highlight. So glad you could join us. We are going to be starting off today with a quick video. If you haven't ever visited the center, this little video will give you a quick glimpse of our facilities, primarily our offices and meeting rooms, and I hope you enjoy it. I hope you enjoyed that little clip. We're going to give brief introductions of the faculty, and then I'm going to allow them a little time to share their most common question that they receive. And then we will get to your questions. Now, if our faculty would rejoin us. So at this time, I'd like to introduce to you Dr. Brent Sellers, who is the Center Director and Professor here at the Center. And he specializes in pasture and rangeland weed management. I'd also like to introduce Dr. Philipe Moriel, Assistant Professor, who specializes in beef cattle nutrition and management. Dr. Maria Silveira, Professor, with a specialty in soil and water sciences. Chris Prevatt, State Specialized Extension Agent 2 in beef cattle and forage economics. And Dr. Joao Vendramini, Professor, specializing in forage management. Now, if you would please take a few moments to go through and give us your most commonly asked question and your response.
I guess the most common questions that I get, at least in terms of nutrition, is people asking me about byproducts and how much they are able to feed of those byproducts. And obviously, there's no straight answer for that. It really depends on what kind of byproduct and also what kind of animals and what are the goals that you need for that you want to achieve. But one thing it would help us to speed up the process and get you the best answer is if whenever you have access to some kind of byproduct, please have it sent to the laboratory for nutritional analysis so that we can give you a better answer right straight away. Okay, it varies a lot. Even within the same batch of byproduct, you're gonna have a lot of variation in the nutritional composition. So if you have that information in hand, we can give you an answer how much to feed and for how long really quickly. But if not, we're gonna have to wait a few days to have the analysis back. So my recommendation is send it for analysis as soon as possible, and we will help you with whatever you need.
All right, so as the beef cattle and forage economist, I think over the last really 3 to 4 months now, I think the most common question is, one, what's happening in cattle markets, and two, where are things going moving forward? And I think, in response to those two questions, I really start talking with producers and with maybe some news outlets about the issues that are happening both on supply and demand that help us understand how we reach price. So supply issues that we're seeing, definitely the backlog in processing feedlot inventory. Also, while we're maintaining current production, so we haven't been able to start working on really that backlog of feedlot inventory just yet. And that's likely going to take the rest of the year. So you've got this backlog, you've got to work through maintaining that current production while processing, working on that backlog as we can. So that's that major supply issues out there that's not affecting just the feedlot side of the industry. It affects what we receive for feeder calves here in Florida. And then the demand side of our beef cattle market equation right now is, moving forward, you've got a lot of consumers that potentially have had some issues with unemployment. There have been businesses that are closing. In May, bankruptcy was up 48% across the United States. There's civil unrest right now. So all those factors are really affecting discretionary spending for consumers. So, we know where supply is. Demand is very fluid right now, lots of changes and volatility in that. And then just moving forward, whenever we're thinking about markets, we have to think about economics in terms of everyone's taking on more risk with all these unknowns. And no one really wants to assume a great deal more risk right now without having, some certainties. In order to take on that more risk, they have to be willing to potentially receive more of a margin. So whenever you have these processing capacities that are limited, you have civil unrest, you have mandates on what certain businesses are required to shut down. Basically, you have risks like we've never seen it before. So that's kind of really my most common question over the last 3 to 4 months.
I think my biggest question is always about smut grass. Pretty timely right now because we're getting pretty close to when I would start recommending Velpar or Tide hexazinone applications. Some people actually start asking if they could start spraying it, towards the end of May, because we started to get a little bit of rainfall. If they would have applied it before the outer bands of cristobal came across the state last week, it probably would have resulted in a failure because it would have bleached the hexazinone below the root zone of the smut grass. So I most often recommend smut grass management end of June through August. So that's our primary time frame.
Okay, I'll go next. From my perspective, probably the most common question is assistance with soil test interpretation. And before we even get to the numbers, I always ask a couple questions because testing the soil is a relatively simple process, but there are a lot of steps where things can get wrong. So the lab can make a mistake, so there's possibility of laboratory error. The most common mistake is samples are not taken properly. So when the soil properties vary considerably in a pasture, we need to take enough subsamples that really represent the entire area, because all the recommendations are going to be based on a very small amount of soil sample. So I try to go over with the producers to make sure that the sample was collected and handled properly. And if there's a error in the lab, we always recommend that a subsample is saved until the results are back and the producer is happy with the results. Another thing is record keeping. Another way to determine whether or not those results are there's a source of error associated with those results, or if it's really reflecting what's happening in the site, is to look back a couple of years, maybe compare the current results with what's being tested previously, just to make sure there's nothing abnormal. Of course, if you continue to apply nitrogen fertilizer, for instance, the soil pH will decrease, so that's normal, and that's what we expect. But if something changes abruptly and it has nothing related to management, that's when probably there might be an error associated with either how the samples were collected or sometimes how they were handled. They stay in the back of the truck for too long before they were submitted to the lab, or the lab might not be a reputable lab. So all those things that we need to take into consideration in order to help the producers to determine the best fertility approach.
And finally, my more frequent question is related to matching forage species or cultivars to the right environment. We have probably a unique situation here in South Florida if you go south of I-4, because we have many species that you can select and plant. Most of them are warm season perennial grasses, but we have stargrass, Bermuda grass, Limbo grass, brachiaria grass, and then within each species we have the cultivars that also they have specific characteristics and adaptation to some different conditions. And those, I think, are the most frequent questions when producers wanted to select the right species and cultivar to plant in a specific area. And that is certainly a very important decision, because as I mentioned, most of those forages are perennial forages. That is a huge investment that you make and try to take that forage to perennity or to many years that you need to explore. One unfortunate problem is a lot of the questions that I get, they come with a failed experience. So eventually the producer try a different or a new species or cultivar, and then it didn't work for his or her specific situation. So then they want to know the reasons, and they want to know what they need to do in order to make that selection of species and cultivars more successful.
Great, thank you so much for that information, guys. So we have a few questions entered already, and if you didn't catch it earlier, those of you that have just joined us, please use the GoToWebinar panel questions box to type in your questions for our faculty. You can ask a question of a particular faculty member, or if you're not sure who the question might be most appropriate for, just enter your general question and we will get to it shortly. So we are going to start with one from Dennis. He would like to know, how is spreading dayflower controlled in Bermuda or Limbo grass pastures?
Okay, so that's a pretty good question, and it's kind of one of our tougher ways to control. The best luck I've had has been with 2,4-D at 2 quarts tank mixed with AIM, and AIM is a different herbicide that we don't hear much about, but you tank mix that at 1 ounce per acre with the 2,4-D.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Sellers. All right, the next question is from Teresa, and it looks like this is probably for you, Maria. She would like to know, what do you recommend for pasture grass, or maybe Joe, what do you recommend for pasture grass in Myakka City area, sandy soils not built up at all?
I think it's probably a forage selection question, and we do have few options. Sometimes the person in South Florida, we assume that we're gonna have some sandy soils, and we have a lot of forage species and cultivars that are adapted to those conditions. There is no like a true or false recommendation, but in general, another question that will go after what will be a good grass will be what type of management the person is expecting to have. Such as if the person is trying to have their cover and will have in general extensive management with limited fertilization and weed control, I would think that our Bahia grass is probably the most recommended species. And here in South Florida, we have seen that we have some success with Argentina, although the other cultivars also can do well. But the Argentine, that is very common and is a tetraploid, what they call, has a very good value for turf and seed if they eventually try to diversify what they want to do with the grass. And also it has probably among most of the cultivars that we have the best ground cover. So I think Argentine Bahia grass for low and more extensive management systems is in the region of Myakka City may be a good recommendation, but you also need to see how poorly drained the place is. Bahia grass can tolerate some poorly drained soils for limited time. It's if it's eventually an area that stay underwater for about 2 weeks during the summer, so then the person probably need to change the plan and try to work with some of the limbo grasses.
Thank you, Joe. All right, the next question is very long, and I'm going to read it, but we should probably break it up into parts. And this question is being asked of Ed. He would like to know, let's see, he says, I often get questions about fertilizer application and rainfall timing. If fertilizer is applied to established forage crops and it does not rain for several weeks, what is the fate of those nutrients? That's the first part. Next, conversely, if fertilizer is applied and we have a large rain event, how much of the nutrient is picked up by the root system?
I can answer that question. And my answer is based on research that we've been doing for many years in Ona. So the timing of fertilizer application, it's quite tricky. And many times the decision is not so much on the biology, the plant, but more likely related to the practical standpoint. So whenever producers can get their pastures fertilized. But definitely this time of the year, if you have not fertilized your pasture, I would not recommend to do it right now because of the intensive rainfall, the water table. If you are in central South Florida, where the water table reaches the surface, is probably pretty high. So those conditions are conducive to nutrient transport. So we have different very sophisticated instruments to measure leaching and runoff. And basically the entire year we don't measure anything. If we ever catch any nutrient losses, is this time of the year that's when it happens, because of the water table is close to the surface and nutrients can very easily move out of the system. So the first question was, what happens if you don't have enough rain? Most of the nutrients, nothing is going to happen to the nutrients, especially phosphorus and potassium. They'll stay in the soil. With a little bit of moisture that you get, maybe not rainfall, but the dew, and if the temperature optimal for plant growth, plants will be able to utilize that nutrient. So I wouldn't recommend applying fertilizer before early in the season, like January, February, because we still have a chance of getting a frost. So as long as we don't expect any frost, the temperature is warm enough for the plants to be active and growing, I would say the nutrients don't go anywhere. They only move if there's water moving. And the worst scenario, just want to go back, the worst scenario is to fertilizer this time of the year. This is when we don't want to fertilizer. If you haven't done it this time of the year, is a good time to plan ahead and maybe think about next year, do a soil sampling in the fall to make sure that the soil pH is adequate before you even consider fertilization. I hope that answers the question.
Okay, thanks, Maria. This last little part he mentions is he said he thought that Dr. Rexeagle had done work on different amounts of rainfall, but he can't find anything on it. So might you be able to help him with that later?
Sure, I'll be happy to. I don't, off the top of my head, I don't recall anything related to but timing of fertilization. Yeah, probably Dr. Rexeagle has done that, and splitting application. Yeah, I'll be happy to help with that. Many times the splitting application, since I started, I have to finish. Splitting application, when we talk a typical established perennial pasture, the rates that we typically apply, most producers, they apply anything between 50 and 80 pounds of nitrogen. So for that rate, it doesn't make sense to split the application because the plants can utilize that 80 pounds of nitrogen to the acre very efficiently. So there's really not benefiting splitting application, unless if it's I'm talking about Bahia grass pasture, unless if, of course, you are stockpiling for winter, then a late season fertilization makes sense. But otherwise, for the rates that we typically do, we don't split fertilizer application. Of course, hay production is a different scenario. Depending on the level of fertilization that you are using, then it makes sense. But overall, for established pasture, there's no benefit in split applying the fertilizer.
Okay, thank you so much. All right, next question. Teresa says she's interested in planting olive trees. Any recommendation as to developing the soil, which is sandy, and watering for the first 2 to 3 years and beyond?
That might be a question for the Gulf Coast Research Center or the Port Science Department or Manatee County Extension.
Okay.
I have no experience with olive trees, but what I want to say, every plant requires 17 essential nutrients. That doesn't mean that those nutrients need to be applied as fertilizer. As long as the soil pH is adequate for the crop. I don't know what is the optimum pH for that particular crop, but as long as the pH is adequate, and I imagine this is a small scale operation, if that's the case, if you have access to organic amendments, anything that can increase the organic matter in the soil. Of course, it's difficult to increase organic matter in our Florida soils, but that should also help. But the specifics about that crop, I'm sorry, but I cannot comment on it.
Okay, thank you. Next question is from Joe. He says, is there anything that can be done to aid in pasture grass production on land that has a copper level of 30 ppm? He says grass dies in those areas, and as for the land history, it is an old citrus grove.
I guess that question is for me again. Well, I would say, what is that 30 ppm means? Is it a total copper? Is it extractable copper? So there's a couple of questions. Are there any symptoms that in the forage that it's indicates copper toxicity? And if, let's say, those answers are yes, there's 30, the level, and I can't remember off the top of my head what is the threshold for copper. And again, it will depend if we're talking about total or extractable. But let's say in a scenario where those levels exceed the threshold, the best way to minimize potential detrimental effect is to manage the pH. Usually metals in the bioavailability can decrease significantly if you increase the pH. So I don't know what type of crop, forage crop, of course, Bahia grass doesn't tolerate high pH, but let's say it's a Bermuda grass type of forage that can tolerate higher pH, maybe manipulating the pH is the best strategy to minimize toxicity issues.
Okay, thanks, Maria. All right.
And just to complement, 30 ppms of copper, if it's in a forage, is not much. The requirement for cattle is 10 ppm, and you're only going to have toxicity if you are above 200 ppm. So I think in that case, it's not a problem.
Even in the soil, 30 parts per million also doesn't sound very high either. But again, I don't know what kind of extraction.
Okay, so maybe something else is wrong that's causing the grass to die. So what would you advise for him to do, or what should be done?
Test the soil and the plant tissue to make sure it's not something else.
Okay, thanks. All right, Chris. Under the current market conditions, what calf weight is ideal to market calves to optimize profit? And that's the question from Dennis.
So I wouldn't say it's a certain weight right now. I would say it's more market conditions. You know, a 350-pound calf on June 1st was worth more than a 500-pound calf or a 550-pound calf March 1st. So I mean, it's more marketing when when we have these different waves in the market. Whenever markets are on a run, that's when we have the opportunity to go ahead and market cattle. And then in terms of weights, maybe the other scenario is what weight do I have to get to optimal numbers of truckload units? Truckload units are going to add $15 to $20 per head easy. So I think that's another scenario to think about in terms of marketing. I'm going to take a hit if I have 40 leftover calves. So I want to if possible market in truckload units as much as possible. But I think right now, just in terms of the markets, it's marketing when these opportunities present themselves right now. Everyone thinks it's a V-shaped recovery, but again, there'll be waves, there'll be seasonal increases and decreases based on these shocks to our economic systems right now. Again, we're still in a recession. That's not going away. Commercial real estate has been destroyed. So, there's some tough times ahead for us right now. It's not all behind us in terms of the economic pain.
Thanks, Chris. Next question is from Bridget. She asks, I'm often asked how to determine stocking rate. Dr. Vendramini, could you explain some of the considerations when determining stocking rate on a given pasture?
Yes, and that is probably the biggest challenge in cow-calf production in South Florida, primarily because of the variation in herbage accumulation, right? The forage doesn't grow very well during the winter, and then summer forage start growing up, and then it comes down again in the fall. And in general, we have this stocking rate, like the number of animals that we have in our property. It doesn't vary much. You have calves that come in, go out, but we don't have that ability to, okay, now we don't have forage, you have to remove animals. And then we have to put those animals back in the summer when you have more forage. So that is a good question, and it is the challenge. So with that said, I would say that to adjust the stocking rate on a practical standpoint, you need to check what is the stubble height of your forage. So if you have a bahia grass that has been really grazed down during the growing season, let's focus on the growing season right now. So then you have problems. So if you have a forage that is shorter than 3 inches during that time that the forage is growing, so that's a problem that you are overstocking even in that time that the forage is growing. I have a scientific method that sometimes for people that really like forage is easy to translate in practical management. But in general, what we say is we need 1 pound of live weight of an animal exposed to 1.5 or 2 pounds of forage. So that's what you have. So the problem is how to measure those 2 pounds of forage. We can weight our animals easily, but to have that number for the forage amount that we have on the field sometimes is not practical. So people have problems in trying to account for the amount of forage. So what I tell them is just manage your stubble height. So if you see that you are grazing too short or below the recommendation that we have, for example, for Bahia grass, for Limbo grass will be 7 inches. For Bermuda grass, maybe between 5 and 6 inches. If you are grazing shorter than that during the year, it's a sign that you are overstocking. So I think it's the most practical ways to have a ruler and then to manage the height that you have in your forage year long. So if you are too short, you are overstocking.
Okay, thanks, Joe. All right, next question is for Dr. Moriel. Can you explain the relation between energy and protein values when selecting a winter supplementation program? And that question's from Bridget.
Yeah, so it really depends on what kind of animal you are feeding at that time of the year, right? So for mature cows that are lactating, you're gonna need about 52% energy and let's say 9 to 10% protein. But again, that depends on how much milk production stage, when that cow calved, and also body conditioning score. So the best thing that I would advise you to do is to always make sure that there's plenty of forage available, and we can always play with the amount of energy and protein in the supplement. But in our experience, if your cows are calving around 5.5%, 5.5 body conditioning score about November, and you provide them molasses 16% at about 5 pounds per cow per day, that's plenty to maintain their condition score and throughout the entire winter season. So yeah, they highly correlated, but the amount that we need to include really depends on the type of animal, like I said, first calf counts, mature counts, and also the quality of your forage. So test your forage. Once you have that, that's the majority of the feed that that animal will consume. We can determine how much protein and energy we need to fill that gap. And you can send me that kind of questions anytime you guys want to. Just send me the forage analysis. What are the animals you have? And we'll get you the answer.
Thank you. Okay, Dr. Vendramini, Dennis would like to know what Bahia grass variety do you recommend for pasture?
And I think, as I mentioned when I start, sometimes those decisions are based on your specific conditions. We have seen that some of the different cultivars may behave differently in different locations. Such as here in South Florida, because we usually have a much warmer year and warmer winter, the tetraploids or the Argentine has been the one that has performed the best for us. However, if you go to North Florida, the Panhandle area, the Argentine do really well as much as the other cultivars. But some cultivars, such as the Riata and the Tifton 9, they tend to grow a little more in the fall because they were selected for that purpose to have a little greater forage production in the fall. So Tifton 9 and Riata, they sometimes behave similarly in that matter. But remember that their forage production is not only based on the cultivar. So if you don't have rain in the fall, so then the cultivar will not be responsive. And that has been one of the limitations of the different cultivars as well. Sometimes you have something that will produce better in the fall, but you don't have the rainfall, so you don't express that potential. But in general, here in South Florida, I think Argentine do really well. Pensacola, we have some fields, but we don't see a lot of advantage of having Pensacola over Argentine. And then we have the improved varieties, as I mentioned, Tif Quick. Tiff Quick is a selection of Tifton 9, and the selection is based on faster germination. But again, you pay the price and you pay a little more for the seed. Tiff Quick, Tifton 9, Riata, they behave similarly. They are all diploids that were tested for a little better forage production. So you have those conditions that I mentioned to you. So it's specific about the location, I think.
Okay, thanks, Joe. All right, so now I have a question for Brent. It's from Ed Jennings, and he asks, he has heard about Duracore. He says that it is not doing a good job on pigweed. Do you see any other shortcomings with this product?
All right, so that's how I was going to close my presentation today, but that's okay. I was going to talk about Duracore anyway, because it is a new product that's come out from Corteva. I've been talking with the Corteva Rep Haley Basin quite a bit about the shortcomings of Duracore, and I think we've come to an agreement that if 12 ounces went out per acre, it was probably too low. The rate range that Corteva has provided has been 12 to 20 ounces. At 12 ounces, that's not even enough to kill tropical soda apple. So for Florida, 12 ounces isn't going to work for us. So we need to be at least 16 ounces. And it has the same shortcomings as Grazing X does. If you're trying to get broad spectrum weed control, you're going to have a tank mix partner, whether that be T4D, Weed Master, Pasture Guard Remedy, whatever. So I see its limitations as being pretty much the same thing as Grazing X. We just have to make sure the rate starts at 16 ounces and doesn't go lower.
Okay, thank you, Brent. All right, one more question for Dr. Sellers. What is your recommendation for managing Kogan grass?
That's another tough one. So
the question asks, I mean, for pastures, yes, but even for like a yard, if it's a problem in a yard.
Okay, so if it's in a yard, I mean, the only thing we have is glyphosate. That's going to be the only product, and as soon as you see reemergence, spray it again, because more than likely it's going to keep coming back from the root system. So there's two general patterns that I use for Kogan grass management. One is usually we're spot treating it. So one is we're using a 1% solution of Arsenal or Chopper. If you have oak trees nearby, Arsenal is not going to be your choice. So you want to switch to glyphosate. And so with glyphosate, it would be a 3% solution for a spot treatment. With glyphosate, you have to come back every 6 months, plus or minus. You just have to go out and scout those areas that you've already treated. With Arsenal or Chopper, you can go back every 12 months. So the Arsenal has more residual, or has residual, where glyphosate doesn't. So that's how I approach it. Now, if you have an entire 20 acres that's taken over, then we're looking at a more severe management plan where that would include burning, a month of regrowth, treatment with either glyphosate or Arsenal, and then waiting 3 or 4 weeks, and you can burn it again, and then start tillage. I prefer you really start this process in the fall, because then you'll start your tillage operations late December, early January during our dry season, because we want to dry up the rhizomes that are in the soil as much as possible. So it's a very short answer to a very complicated problem, but we do have some fact sheets on this that can help guide you through that process as well.
Okay, thanks, Brent. All right, one last question for Dr. Moriel. What nutritional supplement regimen do you recommend for cows with calves?
Our experiences with at Ona, at least, we start supplementing those cows that calve around November, end of October, mid-November. We start supplementing those cows around December, second to third week of December, about 5 pounds of molasses with urea, right, and a 16% crude protein supplement. And that is plenty for us to minimize the body condition score loss. They will lose about half of a point over the entire winter season, but by the end of the breeding season, they start to recover. So for us, it had worked out really well. That doesn't mean that's the only option. You can also do slurry, molasses with cottonseed meal. Anything actually that you have available could be used. Now it's just a matter of price, how much you purchase, and how much and what kind of supplement that you have. But molasses itself is not always the cheapest, so it really varies throughout the year. It's just one of several examples that we can do. So some people also cannot handle liquid feed and will have to use dry feed as well, and there's no problem with that. We can always work it out with you depending on your scenario. So like I said at the beginning, these nutritional programs, they're very, there's like infinite amount of possibilities that you can do. We really have to work on an individual basis. So tell me what you need, what are your conditions, and what you have access to in terms of feed, and we'll work it out with you and develop a program that will meet your needs.
Thank you, Philippe. Okay, well, the time has come. Thank you so very much for all the wonderful questions. If we have not gotten to your question yet, the faculty will be in touch with you after the event closes. They will all receive a copy of all the questions that were asked today. And now we would like for them to sign off with a bit of timely advice for you. So we'll start off with Philippe.
Okay, so at this time of the year, we're preparing to get close to weaning time, right, for the majority of the producers. This is a great time to sort your cows based on their body condition scores, right? Especially because of the price of cattle and the price of feed, you want to be very strategic with the supplementation program. So just use the supplementation for those animals that actually need supplementation. So a good time to do is that at weaning, when you're removing the calves, sort those cows that are below 5 and those that are above 5. Those cows that are above body condition score 5, they will gain about half of a point or maybe a little bit more just on grass until the time of calving. But those that are below 4, I recommend we start supplementation program with those animals. So at Ona, we are able to put around half to 1 body condition score unit when we supplement cows for about 90 days with either 2 pounds of distillers grains, dry distillers grains, or about 2.2 pounds of molasses with urea, right? You can also do that with cubes, about 2.2 pounds per cow per day for 90 days. That will make them gain close to 1 body condition score unit and calve in the optimal body condition score of 5 to 6. So you don't, like I said, you don't have to supplement all of them, but at least sort them between those that need the supplementation, those that are okay, and be strategic with the amount of supplementation you need to purchase.
So, Philippe mentioned it there in terms of cattle prices being low. And it's really, when cattle prices are low, what can producers do? And my thoughts first is, if there's not much we can really do on the revenue side, really just searching for lower ways to reduce our unit costs of production, such as, look for where we can get more efficient in terms of utilizing inputs, reducing waste, especially in 2020 and 2021. If we have cash flow limitations, it's definitely going to be scrutinizing capital purchases like tractors, machinery, equipment, and really reducing debt loads. It's going to be very important for us to make it through this time period. On the cattle side of things, for marketing our cattle, months to sell really kind of, it might have went out the window in terms of picking a high of the year. I mean, I think this is a very volatile marketplace. you've seen a $40 hundredweight decline, a $30 hundredweight increase. So just enhancing cattle. Think about the investments we make in genetics here in 2020 and how that can improve the quality and quantity we sell for the future. In terms of the question I received, identify economical weights to be able to market in truckload units, whether that's marketing, them at 450 pounds or 700 pounds. Identifying that economical weight that you can take your cattle to and get them put on truckload units. I think the little bit of advice that I share in each presentation is, one, for 2020, our focus has to be on surviving. I think we're gonna, over the next several years, we'll lose about 15 to 25% of the cattle industry due to low prices and just really not seeing positive returns over variable costs. We got to continue to do a lot of the things that got us here, and just in terms of continuing to wage a war on feeding and forage costs, and then preparing for the next drought. Because if we don't have the forage out there, it's going to be very difficult for us in a limited hay scenario that we are in Central and South Florida.
Okay, so the last couple of weeks we started getting rainfall, and I've really started to see weeds jump in size. So we're kind of getting, again, like I said in the beginning, that we're getting close to that window of smut grass control too. So if you have smut grass and you also have other weeds like dog fennel, tropical soda apple, or goat weed, don't think that you have to use multiple herbicides, because hexazinone is very good on a number of weed species. So it will control dog fennel, it will control goat weed, it will at least control the top growth, the tropical soda apple, and also actually control some nutsedge species as well. So if you plan on targeting smut grass, it's going to pick up a lot of weeds if you use a hexazinone later this month. So don't think that you have to use something like Grazing X and Pasture Yard to kill the soda apple and dog fennel now. If you don't have the smut grass, then take mix of Grazing X with Pasture Guard, or Duracor with Pasture Guard, or whatever tank mix partner you want to use. You need to start thinking about increasing the rate of the tank mix partner with the Grazing X or Duracor to help pick up those larger dog fennel. And if you have specific questions about that, please feel free to reach out.
Okay, I'll go next. From my perspective, if the conditions permit, test your soil, of course. If your soil is underwater right now, wait until the water table goes back to the normal conditions. Record keeping, like I said in the beginning of my presentation, is very important for comparison purpose. And pay attention to the soil pH. So if, with the conditions, economic conditions being tough, if you have to choose how to better invest your money on the soil fertility program, definitely the soil pH should be the first target. So if you have a low pH, spending money on nitrogen fertilizer does not make sense. In fact, you can stress the plants even further. So maybe dolomite, in years where we don't have a lot of resources available, dolomite or any lining material will be a good option. And of course, the fertilizer prices are relatively low right now. If you can take a look at the soil test results, and maybe if you can afford to apply more fertilizer. And again, we don't fertilize the soil. In Florida, our fertilizer philosophy is a little different, because our soils have very limited nutrient holding capacity. So we fertilize the plants. We only use commercial fertilizer or any type of byproduct to increase forage production or nutritive value. We don't build up fertility in our soils. It's very difficult. And the only way we can build up fertility is by producing more forage, and the below ground biomass decompose, and that becomes part of soil organic matter. But in other words, again, the target is the plant and not the soil necessarily. Consider enrolling in BMP programs, because they will also offer opportunities for cost sharing programs. So there may be opportunities for you to benefit from that. Take advantage of byproducts. If you are in a part of the state where biosolids or manure are available and you are allowed to apply, take advantage of those byproducts, because if they are managed properly, they can give the same results as commercial fertilizer. And again, record keeping. I think that's about it. Don't apply any fertilizer when it's wet, because most likely the fertilizer will end up in the ditch.
And I will finish relating my last comments to the question regarding the stocking rate. I think one recurrent thing that we see every year is the springtime, how critical it is for our cows and calves and for the forage on the management standpoint. Because most of the times during the spring is when the cows have calves and we are during the breeding season. So those cows need to keep the body condition score and need to be in good shape to rebreed and also to provide milk to the calf. And what happened is we get in February, March here in South Florida, start getting a little warm. So, and the producers decide to fertilize. And it's just a reminder that because it's a little warm and because you fertilize doesn't mean that you're gonna have forage. So then they pretty much quit the feeding program because it's a little warmer and you just fertilize and then you assume you're gonna have forage. But we have to remember that historically that March and April are somehow dry months for us. Even if you have some temperature, sometimes we don't have the rainfall. So the decision of feeding hay or supplement to those cows should not be on the month of the year, but actually at the condition on the forage that we have. And that situation will lead to overgrazing because the forage is trying to grow, is close to the ground, and you probably decrease the supplementation or don't feed the supplement, so the cows just try to get the most out of the pasture, and then you have an overgrazing scenario in the time that is most critical for your production system. So be prepared and pay close attention to that springtime, because I think it's quite important for the cow standpoint and also for the success of your forage in the long run.
Thank you, Joe. All right, well, this concludes our program for today, and we greatly appreciate everyone joining us today. Thank you again for joining us for today's webinar. Before you go, I'd like to share with you some upcoming events for June and July. June 29th through July 3rd, we will be having a virtual youth field day. Every day at 2 o'clock, you are invited to join us for a fun educational session. We've been sharing this information through our Fridays news blasts, and also let's see how else. It's on our website, and we hope that you can join us. It's for all ages. Primarily, the target audience is students ages 8 to 18. So please check that out and sign up to attend. Our next Ona Highlight will be July 14th at 11 a.m. with Dr. Brent Sellers providing a Ona Weed Science Program highlight. Title of his presentation is Applying Hexazinone with Fertilizer for Smut Grass Control. Always, we are available to answer your questions. We invite you to stay connected with us through our website. Please, if you haven't already, like us, follow us on Facebook and Twitter and YouTube. And if you are not on our email list, we invite you to sign up today. Just send us an email at ona@ifas.ufl.edu and let us know if you prefer to get your emails, your news by email, or if you would rather have newsletters, which are done quarterly by United States Postal Service regular mail. In that case, please provide us with your street, city, state, and zip code. If you were not able to ask a question today, or you think of something else you want to know, please reach out to our faculty, or you're welcome to give us a call here at the Research Center at 863-735-1314. Our Secretary Loria will be glad to connect you to whomever it is that can best help you. We hope you have a great day. Thank you again for joining us for today's Ona Highlight.